me now is our correspondent Emmanuelle Chaze, who lives now in Kyiv. She's over with us here in Paris at the moment. She's with me here on set. Emmanuelle, I know you've been to Pokrovsk yourself, on those streets where Catherine was filming over the weekend. Many people now leaving the area.
Absolutely. I was there several times over the course of the summer, and you could really feel a change of atmosphere as opposed to what it was just a few months ago. People at the beginning of the summer were still wondering whether or not they would have to leave, and then in front of Russian advances, they decided to pack and to leave. You have to keep in mind that those people just leave everything behind. They leave their home. They leave also sometimes family members who don't want to go or cannot go. I'm thinking about elderly people, about people with disabilities. We've talked about it quite often. And also something that is quite sad when you go to Pokrovsk is that civilians, when they see foreign journalists, they're actually eager to talk more often than not, because they think that if people abroad is seeing their plight, something will change. And what we've seen those past few weeks is that changes are only for the worst, that people only have to leave to save their lives, and the city is more and more targeted by Russian bombs. So the civilian is bearing the brunt. Civilians in Pokrovsk are bearing the brunt of this war, as is the case for 2.5 years.
I mean, you spend most of your time obviously in Kyiv. It's still very difficult there, isn't it? Air defence is still a major problem, just for one example.
Absolutely. I mean, Kyiv is far from the front line. It's mostly okay to live there. You have a normal life 90% of the time, and then comes night and you have air raid alerts, you have the sound of drones, you have the sound of air defence, you have explosions with windows shaking and residential buildings being hit, not necessarily by drones or missiles, but by the debris that are falling. So nowhere is really safe in Ukraine, even cities that do feel safe. I'm thinking about Kyiv. I'm also thinking about Lviv in the western part of the country. It was recently hit by a missile, and this missile just crushed completely a residential building. It killed an entire family, and those are daily occurrences. Last night it was Zaporizhia, a residential building, 13 people wounded, and this summer has been particularly bloody for civilians. Also a few weeks ago, if you remember, there was that strike against Poltava Institute of Communication. It was a military academy. Almost 60 people died, over 300 people injured. I don't know if we can imagine just the scene of horror that this was in the aftermath of the strike. And those occurrences, those bombings, they are a daily occurrence in Ukraine, and they affect civilian population. Most of the targets are not military. By Poltava, most of the targets are just on civilians, and that's the hardest for the population to go through.
And hearing all of that, I mean, what is the sentiment like now? We're heading into the winter. Obviously, there are some advances, notably that incursion in Kursk, but at the same time, the Russian forces do seem to be encroaching further and further, as we saw in Catherine's report. How are people feeling, if you like?
Well, it's complicated. For example, the Kursk incursion, it was kind of a moral boost for a lot of people. They were finally seeing the Ukrainian army achieving something significantly successful. I mean, the fact that the Ukrainian army had enough force, enough power, manpower, equipment to do that incursion, of course, people were surprised, but they also mostly welcomed this incursion. But there's also a lot of interrogations. What is happening on the eastern front? We see that the Ukrainian forces are still under intense pressure, not just in Pokrovsk, but also in Toretsk, also in Chasiv, where it's very, very difficult, that the situation is very complicated for the army there. Plus, there's been the bombing on all the energy facilities in Ukraine, more than 90% of the thermal power plants destroyed. So people are bracing themselves for a very, very difficult winter.